Chapter 7. The Sandinista Refinement. With the success of the Vietnamese, insurgents worldwide took heart. If a small third-world nation like Vietnam could defeat the United States, anything was possible. This led to increased efforts by insurgents in widely separated areas of the world. And like all efforts to adopt new forms of warfare, some were successful and others were not. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, through evolutionary steps, further increased the emphasis on political development driving the battlefield outcome. They refined the Maoist doctrine by making political strategy itself the endgame. In the Sandinista strategy, political maneuvering would not be the precursor to a conventional invasion, it would serve as the invasion itself, by destroying external support for the Nicaraguan National Guard. However, like previous innovations, it took time, mistakes, and numerous false paths before the Sandinistas found the solution to seizing power. The movement started in 1961, when Thomas Borga and Carlos Fonseca founded the Sandinista Front for National Liberation, FSLN. Although this is the accepted date for the start of the movement, they did not publish a clear manifesto concerning their doctrine at that time, most likely because they had not yet developed one. However, they did state that they were Marxist-Leninists who subscribed to the Foucault theory of insurgency. With Castro's success in Cuba and Che Guevara's popularity, this was a logical choice for a Latin American insurgent at the time. In June 1963, they felt ready to attempt an armed revolution based on that theory. In keeping with the Foucault theory, Borga led approximately 60 guerrillas into Nicaragua, in an attempt to start the revolution. By October, the effort had failed. The simplistic Foucault approach never had a chance of building the organization necessary to overcome the Somoza security apparatus. The few survivors retreated across the border into Honduras and were arrested. Not perceived to be a genuine threat, they served varying times in Honduran prisons and were released. Upon release, the Sandinistas spent the next few years struggling simply to survive while they figured out a new approach. Learning from the mistakes they made and from the failure of similar movements throughout Latin America, they abandoned the Foucault theory. In its place, the FSLN experimented with different approaches to establishing a popular uprising against Somoza. First, they flirted unsuccessfully with an urban revolution. This, too, failed in the same way it failed in other nations. The entire theory of forming guerrilla forces in the cities played to the strengths of the dictator's security forces. After failing in direct attempts at urban warfare, they attempted to organize urban labor but could not organize the labor unions into communist fronts. Refusing to give up, the Sandinistas agreed to try a Maoist people's war. After 2 years of preparation, they selected the area around Pangasinan Mountain to build the base area for their insurgency. In keeping with Mao's concept, they planned to focus on political organization of the peasant population and avoid fighting the National Guard. Led by Borga and Fonseca, the FSLN returned to the mountains in 1966 to establish a peasant support network. However, they were unsuccessful in generating peasant support. As middle-class, college-educated, urban communists, they failed to inspire Catholic peasants. They were making little or no progress and frankly did not seem to understand the peasants' inherent distrust of outsiders. In May 1967, the Nicaraguan National Guard discovered their presence and rapidly moved to destroy them. 25 of the 35 Sandinista cadres were killed during the National Guard's campaign. The surviving Sandinistas were forced to flee, first to the cities and then to Cuba. Finally, they fled to Costa Rica, where they were reduced to financing their organization by robbing banks. After the National Guard's campaign, Anastasio Somoza announced that the Sandinistas had been destroyed. One unexpected benefit accrued from this failed effort in the mountains: the Sandinistas captured the admiration of a number of Latin American students attending Patrice Lumumba Friendship of the People's University in the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev had established this university in an attempt to capture and influence the next generation of leadership in the Third World. To attract future leaders to the communist cause, Khrushchev provided scholarships to promising young socialists or communists from all over the world. Throughout this period, a significant number of Latin American students were enrolled. Because the purpose of the university was to encourage revolution, the faculty naturally provided full reporting on the heroic activities of the Sandinistas. As the Latin American students either graduated or dropped out, they returned home and gravitated to the Sandinista cause. Despite their limited success and even more limited political organization, the Sandinista leadership resolved to continue a people's war. Unfortunately for them, they lacked the clarity of Mao or Ho. The one intellectual Sandinista, Fonseca, produced a concept based on Marxism. However, other than promising to redistribute large land holdings to peasants, it did not provide a coherent message for a rural insurgency. This is a major deviation from both Mao and Ho. Each of them had carefully thought out political agendas that were central to their plans to unify the peasants behind them. Although neither intended to keep the political promises he made, both had an extensive agenda to present to the people as part of Phase I political organization, and they would repeat that theme throughout their struggles. A coherent, applicable message is central to 4GW. However, neither this lack of a message nor the lack of organization kept the Sandinistas from attempting yet again to establish a peasant-based uprising in the northern mountains. In a variation of tactics, they also began to organize an urban insurgency at the same time. Although the main cadres returned to the mountains, urban organizations would be formed to mobilize students, rob banks, instigate labor disputes, and so on. Like all successful insurgents, the Sandinistas kept trying new approaches until they found something that worked. Although they did have limited success in the cities, the Sandinistas once again failed utterly to gain the support of the peasants. In addition to being college-educated outsiders, most of the Sandinistas were also light-skinned urban dwellers who stood out among the much darker mountain peasants. Unable to convert the peasants to their cause, the Sandinistas were easily tracked through the National Guard's network of peasant informants. As a result, the National Guard was able to kill many Sandinista leaders and easily defeat their second attempt to organize the peasants. And once again, defeat brought unexpected benefits for the Sandinistas. During 1971, a small group of university students from affluent Nicaraguan families began to seek alternatives to Somoza's regime. They went to a spiritual retreat run by a Catholic priest. Although supposedly discussing religious issues, they turned the discussion to political issues. Over the course of the next year, they applied Marxist thought to the political situation in Nicaragua. During 1972, they were joined by a Sandinista Commandante for several days of intense discussion. Then in early 1973, they abandoned the retreat and went underground with the Sandinista movement. They provided new blood, political camouflage, and extensive new contacts for the badly battered Sandinistas. This was the Sandinistas' first expansion of the personal networks so vital to an insurgency. The Sandinistas got a second major break on December 23, 1972. Nicaragua's capital city, Managua, was virtually destroyed by a massive earthquake. More than 80% of the buildings were damaged or destroyed, and about 10,000 people were killed. International aid poured into the country and was promptly siphoned off into the personal accounts of corrupt members of the Somoza government. The abysmal failure of the government to help the people purely because they were enriching themselves created an issue the Sandinistas could use. The combination of another setback in the mountains and the rising anger among the people at Somoza's corruption created a sense of urgency among the Sandinistas. The FSLN debated whether to adopt the rural struggle or use a mass urban revolution. The urgency of the debate was enhanced by the feeling that a people's revolt was coming. Conditions in Somoza's Nicaragua were rapidly approaching those of Batista's Cuba in 1959. In the aftermath of the earthquake, Somoza's cronies were squeezing into areas of the economy that had traditionally belonged to aristocratic families not associated with Somoza. These new incursions alienated those powerful segments of Nicaraguan society. The Sandinistas felt that the combination of the corruption and the competition among the elite would inevitably lead to revolt. Yet as far as most of the country was concerned, the Sandinistas had been destroyed. They clearly had a huge challenge to overcome. They had to prove their continued existence and take the lead in the building resistance to Somoza. On December 27, 1974, the Sandinistas executed a daring raid on a holiday party and took hostages. Although they narrowly missed capturing the American ambassador, they did get Somoza's foreign minister and many members of his cabinet. Their successful escape to Cuba with $1 million in ransom spectacularly announced that they were not destroyed and resulted in numerous new recruits. It also triggered an internal struggle in the FSLN among those who sought a Maoist protracted war strategy, those who sought a Marxist proletarian approach, and the terceristas, or third way advocates. The Maoists went back to the northern mountains and were again easily defeated by the National Guard. Their leader, the intellectual Fonseca, was killed in an ambush on November 8, 1976. Once again, Somoza was convinced he had destroyed the Sandinistas. The urban movement also failed. However, the terceristas survived, largely because their key leaders remained outside the country throughout the struggle. From this vantage point, they had the benefit of learning from the mistakes the other factions of the party made while not suffering the casualties that are an inevitable part of such mistakes. In January 1977, the Sandinistas got another major break. Jimmy Carter was sworn in as President of the United States. Although the Carter administration made no immediate major changes in policy in Central America, Nicaraguans perceived that Somoza had lost one of the major pillars of his family's strength, the unqualified support of the United States. As Shirley Christian points out, in many countries, even some others in Latin America, Washington's attitude would have meant little, but in Nicaragua the key to power over public policy was to give the appearance of having the support of the United States, whether the U.S. government was consciously giving this support or not. Like all insurgents, and all warriors for that matter, the Sandinistas learned by trial and error and a series of painful defeats. But finally, they were developing an approach, the third way, that would lead to victory. At this critical juncture, Humberto Ortega took stock of what their failures had taught them. He recognized that his college-educated, urban colleagues could never earn the trust of the peasants. The Maoist concept of a peasant revolution could not work, given the current organization and personnel of the Sandinistas. If he planned to use a Maoist approach, it would require a great deal of time to recruit and train people who could win the confidence of the peasants. Then, examining the earlier Sandinista attempts to use the FOCO theory and incite urban insurgencies, he understood that the prime weakness of both was their failure to develop a political base. Unlike their problem with the peasants, the Sandinistas' inability to create a political base in the cities probably had more to do with their lack of a clear political agenda. His people were city dwellers, so they could blend in and be easily accepted in the cities. Ortega also recognized that the tremendous population shift to the cities made an effort in the urban areas essential to success. Further, he understood that things were happening quickly in Nicaragua. If the movement went back to the mountains to develop a Maoist insurgency, it would be irrelevant to the coming revolution. Ortega understood one other key aspect of the strategic situation. The greatest threat to the Sandinistas was the democratic reform movement. If it succeeded while the Sandinistas were still getting established in the mountains, the cause of the insurgency would be neutralized. The formation of a moderate, reformist government would present the Sandinistas with a much greater problem than the repressive Somoza regime. Ortega's bold solution was to create a third way. He formed a broad front, urban-based coalition whose strength rested in the middle-class businessmen, entrepreneurs, unemployed students, and urban poor of the shanty towns. On May 4, 1977, he published a new FSLN strategy paper called the General Political Military Platform of Struggle for the Sandinista Front for National Liberation. Written primarily by Humberto Ortega, it contained the basic insurrectional strategy, including 1. Development of a program without leftist rhetoric. 2. Creation of a broad anti-Somoza front with non-Marxist opposition groups. 3. Creation of mass organizations to support the FSLN. 4. Agitation to bring about the radicalization of the moderate opposition. 5. Action to undermine the integrity of the National Guard, and 6. Unification of the three FSLN factions under a joint leadership. His emphasis on concealing the FSLN's leftist doctrine combined with active propaganda for a moderate coalition allowed him to convince a wide range of Somoza's opponents to join the coalition. Even without these efforts, Somoza's opponents were driven toward the coalition simply because they no longer had any other outlet for their opposition to his regime. Somoza had driven even legitimate opposition into the shadows. Taking advantage of the alienation of the business class, the Sandinistas used their extensive network of contacts, often even family members, to encourage key business leaders to join this apparently moderate opposition. This was where the recruitment of the upper-class students from the religious retreat proved critical. Given the small size of Nicaragua's elite business community, many of these young adults knew and were even related to key members of the elite. The Sandinistas exploited those connections to push their agenda forward. They were so successful that a group of 12 prominent citizens actually signed a proclamation of opposition to the regime and published it. They became known as Los Doce, the 12. Ortega's success in forming this coalition co-opted most of the opposition factions. By forming the coalition front, the Sandinistas positioned themselves to block any compromise brokered by outside agencies such as the United States. The last thing they wanted was a compromise that could defuse the coming revolution. The Sandinistas' real innovation was that, despite the appearance of a broad front, Ortega ensured that the key elements of power, namely all of the coalition's military and security elements, remained firmly in the hands of the communist leaders. Thus, his third way created a broad base of support with a wide range of allies while maintaining firm control of the revolution. Once the coalition took power, the other members of the coalition found that Sandinistas held all the key positions in the new police and military organizations. The moderates realized too late that this arrangement gave the Sandinistas effective control of the country. With this broad front as a power base, the Sandinistas continued working for the uprising they felt sure was coming. During this period, the FSLN conducted a number of attacks on the National Guard, to keep the movement in the eyes of the people while solidifying the party's control of the front's military arm. At the same time, they moved quietly but effectively to take over all the key security billets. Much more important to the revolution was the work the Sandinistas did to further undermine support for the Somoza regime in the international community. They showed true strategic vision and operational finesse in orchestrating this campaign while simultaneously consolidating their control on the popular front that was opposing the regime. This was made easier by the fact that the Carter administration regarded the Nicaraguan problem as essentially a human rights issue. Other than identifying it as such, the administration seemed incapable of putting together a coherent strategic policy concerning Nicaragua. The Nicaraguans were expecting the United States to provide its normal unilateral solution to their problems. Instead, the administration tried to work through the international community, encouraging Somoza to let an international commission referee between him and the opposition. Somoza was not interested, and the Sandinistas worked hard to ensure that the coalition refused to join such negotiations. The Sandinista attack against U.S. support was based on showing the Sandinistas as a democratic and popular opposition to the corrupt and brutal Somoza regime. The presence of the moderate members of the coalition was essential to this deception. Once they had the moderate and respected leaders in the coalition, the Sandinistas ensured that these were the key spokespeople who met international visitors. There was no talk of a Marxist paradise or the spread of communism. The spokesperson focused on the theme of a moderate, thoughtful opposition trying to remove a hated dictator without plunging the nation into chaos. To spread this message, they used a number of paths. The most effective were the Western media, the priests who supported liberation theology, and peace groups in the United States, particularly mainline Protestant churches. The Western media were invited to Nicaragua to visit with the Sandinistas and report on the atrocities committed by the National Guard. The Sandinistas could count on the Guard committing atrocities virtually every time they operated against the guerrillas. In addition, the media were encouraged to interview members of the coalition, to reassure themselves that the Sandinistas were not communist but simply moderates who sought a representative government after the overthrow of Somoza. The media were encouraged to speak to the young priests who were leading the liberation theology movement. Liberation theology had developed because clergy could see the abuses of the Somoza regime. These priests felt they could no longer follow the bishops, because the official church gave support to the Somoza regime. Given the tremendous prestige local priests held in the very religious Nicaraguan society, they were key elements in the coalition's efforts in the countryside. They also proved highly credible spokesmen for the coalition, both to international visitors and their own parishioners. Another piece of the Sandinista strategy was the effort to use mainline Protestant churches to carry the coalition, Sandinista, message to the U.S. Congress. During this period, they invited numerous members of U.S. congregations to visit Nicaragua and witness for themselves the brutality of the government and the moderate approach of the coalition. They knew that upon their return, these concerned Americans would serve as catalysts in their communities to push for a cut-off of aid to the Somoza regime. Reinforcing the Sandinistas' effort was the fact that the Somoza regime was becoming more and more brutal and therefore provided plenty of material for the Sandinistas to show their American guests. Finally, the Sandinistas, representing the coalition, maintained offices in Washington and New York to ensure that their message was transmitted directly to executive and legislative branch personnel as well as to the United Nations and other international organizations. They understood that a multitude of new players were on the international scene and made major efforts to influence them to support their revolution. As Ortega predicted, widespread turbulence began. It was genuine grassroots resistance to the abuses of the Somoza regime. Well positioned to control the actions of the coalition, the Sandinistas did not immediately grasp that the uprisings were the ones they had been waiting for. Although surprised by the first few uprisings, the Sandinistas quickly understood their significance and formed a flying column to immediately move to any uprising and attempt to sustain it against government forces. Thus they continued to consolidate their hold on all security and military elements of the coalition while raising the profile of key Sandinistas in the eyes of the Nicaraguan people. With increasing disorder and failed brutal attempts to put down the uprisings, internal and international pressure on the Somoza regime to compromise increased. In November 1978, the International Monetary Fund refused to guarantee $20 million in new loans to the Somoza regime. Other international organizations and banks followed suit. The Sandinistas' efforts to use international bodies to influence the action worked. Still, Somoza would not compromise. Reinforcing his stubbornness, the FSLN leadership ensured, through various selective operations, that no compromise amenable to the government could be proposed. Ortega's actions, combined with Somoza's obstinacy, ensured that the revolution would play itself out. In April 1979, the Sandinistas started their final, three-pronged offensive. First, a general strike was called to tie up the cities. Second, popular uprisings were initiated in 6 major cities. Third, rural columns struck in the north and west. The combination of attacks, their wide dispersion, and the obvious withdrawal of American support simply overwhelmed the National Guard. The insurgents, possessing only minimal military strength, had relied almost entirely on their political strength to achieve final victory. They never conducted large-scale military operations and certainly never conducted the Phase 3 conventional operations characteristic of a Maoist insurgency. According to Manimbo, a Sandinista leader, it was that the sick guerrillas who provided support for the masses so they could defeat the enemy by means of insurrection. This is a critical variation on Mao's concept that the people provide support to the guerrillas so that the guerrillas can defeat the government. The Sandinistas moved 4GW yet another step forward. In his survey of Latin American insurgencies, Col. John Wagelstein, a special forces officer who both trained and fought insurgents over a 30-year career, quoted a Sandinista leader on why the revolution was successful. An armed element is still a key requirement for revolution wherein the cadres are educated and blooded. We earn our leadership positions in the new order by paying our dues in Sierra. The mass appeal of a broad front political organization is also a must in which disaffected non-Marxists and non-Marxist Leninists are brought into the movement. This ensures not only better and wider internal support but outside support that does not have Cuban, Eastern Bloc or Soviet taint can also be obtained. Because of the superior unity and discipline of the party, the real power will not be shared with those who provide essentially window dressing for the revolution. The Church, by now heavily infiltrated with liberation theologists, gives us guerrillas the moral high ground we've never enjoyed before. This honest appraisal shows how the Sandinistas advanced the art of war. Notice he never claims that guerrilla military success was essential to victory. Rather he states that, like all insurgents before them, the leaders learned their trade by fighting. So although the Sandinistas consistently failed in their efforts to instigate a rural insurgency, the rural efforts provided a crucible to toughen the leaders who would lead the guerrilla elements of the insurgency. The Sandinista leader is clear that the broad front political organization was essential, both to attract people to the movement and to ensure external support from non-communist bloc countries. He states that the party, the FSLN, was the real power behind the coalition at all times and had no intention of ever sharing power with the moderate coalition members. The moderates were simply window dressing. Finally, he states that the Sandinistas used the priests and philosophy of liberation theology to provide unassailable moral high ground for the insurgency. Col. John Wagelstein summed up the Sandinista strategic approach as follows. Bringing the mass appeal of broad front political organization into the movement to ensure not only better and wider internal support but outside support that did not have Cuban, Eastern Bloc or Soviet taint. Using the Church, through liberation theology, to give the guerrillas the moral high ground. Not losing sight of the U.S. attention level. Controlling or influencing U.S. and world opinion through the media. Guerrilla chiefs actually wrote editorials for the New York Times. Targeting the U.S. Congress through public opinion and orchestrating the propaganda campaign to minimize the U.S. response. Establishing front groups outside the country to function as public affairs/information offices to generate support for the movement and to pressure the United States into a less responsive mode. Orchestrating and financing guest speakers to U.S. academic, civic and church groups. These groups, in turn, will write letters to U.S. congressmen who hold key committee positions overseeing security assistance operations. Thus insurgency theory took another step forward. Although still using Mao's basic elements, the Sandinistas changed the mix to take the best elements of people's war, liberation theology, and urban insurgency to advance the concepts of fourth-generation warfare. The Sandinistas' unique contribution was to eliminate the requirement for the final conventional military offensive. Their political efforts so severely changed the correlation of forces that the government collapsed, and they occupied the vacuum.